So having talked about harmonization, having talked about really the foundation of where this has started, I want to talk a little bit now about kind of where we're going in the 21st century and kind of how this is going to evolve beyond what it has been now. To really go back to the themes that I think you've seen expressed throughout this series, that in the reality of the globalized world in which we live, no regulator, whether it's the US FDA, the EMA, or a very small country with very few resources, no regulator has all of the resources it needs to do everything that it's expected to do by its parliament and its people. And so because that's true, every regulator has to determine within their own jurisdiction what is really the highest public health risk I'm having to deal with here. And once I figure out what my public health high-risk priorities are, then I have to decide which ones are the ones that only I can address with the resources I have within my country. And are there those that I can address relying on information that I can get from trusted agencies? And so when you think about what might really have to be done locally as opposed to trusting information that you get from others, this is kind of a list that many people will come up with. They say, for example, you have to do the pharmacovigilance within your own jurisdiction. You know, other countries are doing pharmacovigilance in their own jurisdiction, but actually what's happening in your medical system, in the realities that exist within your jurisdiction, is really only something that the local authority can find out to a great degree. When you're looking at issues of supply chain security and trying to keep substandard, falsified drugs off a local market, clearly you can work with others to try to keep that from happening, but actually knowing what's going on your own market and putting into place efforts to try to minimize substandard and falsified drugs on your own market is really something, again, that most people, I think, would argue has to be done primarily at the local level. When you've got a manufacturer within your own jurisdiction that's manufacturing products for your people, really, in most situations, that's going to fall to the local regulator to oversee. And then, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, that this assessment of benefit-risk tolerance within your own community, taking into account all of the various perspectives that are unique to your own jurisdiction, is again something people in other parts of the world cannot do for you because they don't have that perspective. So this is something, again, that has to be done at the local level. And then looking at products and making sure that they meet the need, that they are suitable, that they can actually be utilized given the healthcare system, given the realities of the geography, given the realities of the transport system. Again, this is information that is best known at the local level. And so when you're looking at where I'm going to apply my resources in a regulatory agency that does not have resources to do all things, I think some people would argue this should be some of the highest priorities because these are things that no one else can really do for an agency. So when an agency is then trying to do this prioritization, these are some of the questions that I think they tend to ask. For example, what are the highest risk public health issues? How many resources do I have now and will I have in the foreseeable future? What can I rely on others to do for me? In other words, recognition, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. Or what can I rely on others to inform my own decision? In other words, reliance, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then from this list of things that have to be done within one's own jurisdiction, are these really applicable in my situation? So when you look at the whole circle here of regulatory responsibilities, I think you can kind of divide them into things that you have to do for yourself, things that you can rely on others to give you information that will inform your decision, and then things that you can simply rely on the decisions that others have made in order that so you don't have to repeat that same decision and you feel comfortable relying on the decision that another person has made. Now, when we talk about recognition, generally this has a history of mutual recognition. This is when two countries agree that they will indeed incorporate into what they do the decision, the regulatory decision that another country has made. And this generally does not help historically countries that are in the middle and low income, because it's very hard for people to get mutual agreement with them to recognize decisions that they've been made. Clearly, in all economic circumstances, there have been issues with sovereignty challenges here, where there is the sense that one nation is giving up its sovereignty by allowing another nation to make a decision that they simply are incorporating into their decision. And as we've mentioned throughout this series, sometimes the decision one country makes simply is not right for another jurisdiction for a host of reasons that we've already discussed. So because of this, the idea of recognition, and particularly mutual recognition, while it has some very good examples where it has worked, and it has worked beautifully, there are also a lot of examples where it has a tremendous amount of baggage, and it's been very, very difficult to come to agreements that would allow this very, very tight form of recognition to occur. And so a lot of people now talk about, particularly in the situations that we've been talking about throughout these modules, of this concept of reliance as opposed to recognition. And the idea behind reliance is that rather than recognizing the decision that another agency has made and simply taking that decision on for your agency, you rely on the work products that that agency did in order to come to their decision. For example, the scientific assessment. For example, the inspection report. You have access to that. You rely on their work products, and then you make your own decision that you believe is correct. And it might be the same decision as the previous agency, or for reasons that we've talked about previously, it might be a very different decision. But it does mean for the agency that you're not having to spend your resources on repeating an inspection that's already been done, or repeating a scientific assessment that has already been done. So from a resource sharing, a resource sparing approach, Reliance has a lot to offer to nations when they can work out relationships that people are able to share work products, and then they feel, because of the trusted relationship, that they can rely on those work products to inform their own decision. As you can imagine, this does not have major sovereignty issues, and it does not require that there be mutuality or unilaterally of any kind of a recognition. This is simply a recognition of the trust that you have in another agency, that you want to rely on their documents to make your own decision. So in order to kind of make this into and help it to evolve, which it is in the process of doing, into a much more kind of formal element of 21st century regulation, much more so than it has been in the past, the idea has been discussed of having what are called good reliance practices. Just like we have good manufacturing practices when the global community realized that we would be much better served if we had a common understanding of what we meant by quality manufacturing practices and standards that we were going to hold manufacturers to across the globe. We have good clinical practices that really govern how we conduct clinical trials. We have good laboratory practices. We have good pharmacovigilance practices. We have good regulatory practices. So it's quite natural to think about having good reliance practices that might deal with some of the really pertinent questions when you talk about this process of reliance. For example, when do you rely? How do you decide on whom to rely? What does it mean to have a trusting relationship with another regulatory agency? Are there processes and tools for work product exchange that regulators should use? What is the impact on confidentiality when these work products are exchanged? How do we assure that patient privacy is maintained, if in these documents there are references to patients in ways that would be kept confidential. What is the impact on user fees when you're using the work that somebody else has done? Does that have an impact on the user fees that you charge, or should it have an impact on the user fees that an agency charges? And I think one of the most difficult questions, but one of the most pertinent questions that each agency has to come to is the situation that happens when something goes wrong and you've relied on another agency's work product to make that decision. Now, we all know that we continue to learn new things about products all the time, and that no decision at any given point in time is 100% sure that this product is going to be effective and that this product is going to be safe. As you remember, at this point in time, we're talking about population-based efficacy and population-based safety, not individual-based efficacy and individual-based safety. But when the individual safety gets to a point that it makes a question for population safety, then obviously the issues arise about suspension and withdrawal and changing. And those are the times when regulators, I think, feel most vulnerable for having made a decision. And it's when your parliaments rightfully ask on behalf of their people, why did you trust this other agency? Why are we in this situation? And I think as a regulatory agency, you have to be able to answer why you decided to trust this agency and trust their work product as opposed to doing it yourself. And there are ways to do that, and there are perfectly good rationale for doing it. And I think in a good reliance practice document, it could be agreed what kind of due diligence one agency should do in order to say, I check this out and this out and this out and this out, and because of this due diligence, I knew I could trust this agency. It doesn't mean everything's going to work perfect, just like it doesn't work perfect on any agency. But I did the due diligence that the international community agrees is the due diligence that needs to be done in order to establish a trusting relationship. I think here too, you could begin to talk about some of the questions of what is in it for the agency on whom the second agency has relied. Are there risks for that agency in sharing such kind of documents? And again, these are things that a broader international discussion and coming to an international consensus on what this means in terms of reliance as this becomes a 21st century good practice is something that we're going to continue to need to look into. So the community, particularly under the imprimatur of the World Health Organization, is indeed developing formal good reliance practices, or at least talking about the development of these, and making, as I said, good reliance practices an international best practice, just like the other GXPs that we have. And I think it's important to remember, this is not something that the community is saying to low and middle income country regulators. This is something you need to do because you don't have enough resources. This is something that all regulators need to do, whether it's EMA, whether it's US FDA. None of them have all of the resources they need, and all of them will need to look at how they can rely on others to greater and lesser degrees depending on the amount of resources they have. But this is not a low-income or middle-income best practice. This is a global best practice that I think we will see as we get further into the 21st century. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about regionalization. We talked in the last module about what was happening in the African context, and this is another way to address resource constraints, both at the financial and at the expertise level. And there are a whole lot of different models of regionalization when you think about what has happened, what is happening, and what people are discussing about that might happen, that go from informal to formal work-sharing modules, from formal reliance to actual recognition, going to unification that we were talking about earlier when you think in context of perhaps regional authorizations like we have with the centralized process in Europe, and really regional agencies, again, like we have in the European experience with the European Medicines Agency. I think when we think about regionalization, there are very different kinds of examples. I mean, if you think about continental countries like the US and Canada and Australia, you have a regionalized agency, in that you have an agency that is responsible for these regulatory activities within a large region that happens to be a country. And we also have a very interesting situation like China and India, where you have very large regional countries, as it were, but where you have a central agency, but you also have a history of very powerful provincial and state agencies that play a role, and an evolving role, in how products are regulated in those particular settings. So when you talk about regionalization from the continental or very large country perspective, I think it's important to remember the differences that exist in the truly federal kind of approaches that you have in Australia, Canada, and the US, and the mixed approaches that you have in India and China, where you have a federal agency, but you also have very powerful state and provincial agencies that play an interdigitated role in how products are overseen in those countries. Then, as we've mentioned in looking at the European Union, you have a true regional approach there, where it has gone and developed over the last 50 years, as we talked about in the second module, into a truly regional agency, which is the coordination of a network, but which results in the end with a single decision, which is valid in all of the member states of the European Union when it goes through the centralized process. We talked about the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative and some of its approaches of developing a regional approach within the African Regional Economic Community context that we see already happening in the EAC and now beginning to happen in West Africa in the EAC counterpart, Regional Economic Community in the western part of Africa, and what we've seen in the southern part of Africa in the Zazibona and some of the other southern African regional economic community activities. We mentioned ASEAN and the Caribbean in the previous lecture, again, as examples of how people in many of these areas of the world are seeing regionalization as a way of trying to leverage their resources in a way that is efficient and yet still very scientifically valid and focused on addressing issues that could perhaps be unique to the geography and to the cultures that these particular regions encompass. So, we've talked a lot about harmonization, we've talked a lot about regionalization, we've talked a lot about what globalization is causing to happen in the 21st century in the world of regulation. But I wanted to just spend the last couple of minutes talking about some other things that are also happening in parallel. Whereas clearly I think we've seen in globalization this is an entity that has happened and is moving along and is going to continue to evolve, perhaps in some of the ways we've been talking about. There are others, drivers that I think it would behoove all of us to kind of keep our eye on as we get further into the 21st century. One is the new technologies and new methodologies for discovering drugs, for manufacturing drugs, for testing drugs, for marketing drugs that really do not fit the paradigms of the mid-20th century, which are still the fundamental legal and regulatory paradigms that most countries have at this point in time. One is the idea of a much more big data-driven, IT-driven, post-initial authorization-driven, adaptive or progressive licensing idea, where instead of doing all the way through to the end of phase 3 and then having a magic moment in history where the product goes from being very tightly controlled in the clinical trial process to being marketed to 300 to 400 million people very quickly, and then learning things that perhaps you would have wanted to learn in a much more controlled manner, to saying, particularly in situations where you have serious and life-threatening illnesses, and even in situations where you're looking at a new product, if you get to a point where you've shown efficacy and there is a group for whom the benefit-risk profile that you know at that point in time exists, is there a way to authorize the product for that group and to control its post-authorization use so that it is only used in that group, and that you have post-authorization systems in place that allow feedback to the community and to the regulator and to the manufacturer, so that as further information is developed, you can have further licensing, and if you need to, licensing that restricts the population or that widens the population, but that there is a continuous feedback into this kind of a progressive licensing paradigm, as opposed to the much more kind of binary licensing paradigm that's existed from the 21st century. Other things that are driving are the development of what are known as combination products, where in order to better treat given diseases and to use new technologies, drugs are combined with medical devices, biologics are combined with drugs, biologics are combined with devices. And if you remember, our kind of stovepipe 20th century approach to regulation is that we have a way of regulating drugs. We have a way of regulating biologics. We have a way of regulating devices. What happens when you put them together? And it's a combination product. Which paradigm do you use? Which manufacturing do you use? How do you assure the safety and the quality of these kinds of products that don't really fit well into the more stovepiped individual classifications that were developed in the 20th century, when clearly those were the kinds of products that existed? You've seen, we mentioned a little bit earlier in these modules, the reality of the development now of biosimilars and biosubstitutable drugs, as many of the early biotech products are now coming off patent. And we realize that the approach that works in small molecules of bioequivalence in many respects is not going to be adequate for being able to show biosubstitutability. But as the country in the United States back in 1984 was faced with the issue, well, how do we deal with this issue of the public policy of trying to expedite copies of products so that the prices of products go down once patent has expired? How do we do this in the world of biotechnology products, where the science of the products simply do not allow us to treat them the same as we treated small molecules back in 1984? We have new manufacturing methods that involve nanotechnology and nanoparticles. We have products now that are being authorized that come from 3D printing. And then we have the reality of personalized medicine that continues to grow with our knowledge of the genetic and the molecular basis of disease and of treatments for diseases. And the very real regulatory issue is that as you get to personalized medicine, have we in essence turned every drug into an orphan drug because it's for such a unique population? So, I mean, how these fit into the 20th century schemes and how the 21st century schemes are going to be modified to address this new technology and these new issues, which are happening and are going to happen and are going to force changes in the way that we do regulation, are things that I simply wanted to put on the table so that you would be aware of them and would be something that you could continue to follow as these came out. And finally, I wanted to talk about, as I mentioned earlier, the rise of health technology assessment and health technology assessment bodies, and how this is going to play into the question of 21st century access. And I mean it from the perspective of, from the patient's perspective. And I think for those of you that follow the situation in Europe, this is already an issue there where the HTA agencies play a critical role in making the decision of which products are going to be available for their citizens and which products are not, because these are the agencies that are deciding which products the national health schemes in these countries are going to pay for and which ones they are not going to pay for. So you've got this situation that's evolving of the traditional market access regulators, such as the European Medicines Agency and the Commission, or at the national level, the MHRA in England, or BfArM in Germany, or others throughout continental Europe, who are making the decisions as they have historically based on the safety, efficacy, and quality of the product, so that the product is available in the sense of being in the toolkit that that country has. But then there's another agency that's making the decision of, do we need this product? Are we going to pay for this product? How are we going to use this product and compared to other products? And while they only want to do it on products that are found to be safe, effective, and made in a quality manner, they're looking at other kinds of data, looking at cost effectiveness data, looking at comparative effectiveness data, which, as you remember when we talked about the standard for the market access, in these countries, people are not required, the manufacturers are not required to show that their product is better than any other product on the market. They're simply required to show that the benefit-risk profile of their product is indeed acceptable and positive, and then how this product competes in the armamentarium and where it fits in the armamentarium in a given country is decided by others depending on the social setting in that country. So as more and more countries get into this issue of deciding which products are going to be used, how they're going to be used, which ones are going to be paid for, and they're looking at a data set that sometimes is overlapping with the market access regulator, sometimes it's complementary to, sometimes it's quite different from what the market access regulator is looking at. The question is going to evolve as to, do we continue to need both of these systems? Do we need to figure out how these systems come closer together? Do we need to figure out which of these systems has special expertise in certain areas, and those are the areas they should concentrate on? It's going to be a question for regulation as we get into the 21st century, and the issue of cost and the issue of availability becomes a major question, not only in high-income countries, but in middle-income and low-income countries. And then finally, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, this emphasis within the communities around the world on transparency with consumer empowerment, the issue of the need for continual status as a prescription drug versus consumer access through over-the-counter or pharmacy-only medications. It's, again, I think, going to be something that is going to play a larger and larger role in the 21st century, not only driven by the realities of consumer empowerment, access to information, but also by the cost factors involved in paying and who pays for over-the-counter as opposed to who pays for prescription drugs. Again, this issue of where these products fall on the spectrum of regulation from over-the-counter to pharmacy-only in countries that have a pharmacy-only classification of drugs to true prescription requirements are going to be an issue that, from a regulatory perspective, regulators and governments in the 21st century are going to have to look at. So I think you see these are things that are going to have impact on data flow in the larger community, and industry is going to have to come to grips with realizing that their data is much more available and much more transparent. The increased transparency between regulatory agencies and the reality that they're talking to each other, and just that industry has got to become comfortable with this new business model, that it's not just a relationship between them and an individual agency. It really is a relationship with the global regulatory enterprise and community, and with the larger global community when it comes to information and messaging and transparency in what is supporting these products and what these products can do and what they can't, and what the safety profile is. So in summary, as we look back over these 5 modules, I hope you see the theme throughout here, that we've gone from the world where we had individual regulators looking at their own country to all the things we've been talking about in the new world of globalization and post-globalization, that really no one agency is the gold standard. I mean, that is a moniker that each agency must earn each day. And it really is only as valid as the last decision that that agency made. That no national agency or regional agency has a monopoly on good science or good regulatory practices. That we've been learning, and we continue to learn, that the sum of their parts is clearly superior to their individual value. And this one that we've said, I think, in every one of the modules is that no agency has the resources to meet the expectations of their people and their parliaments, that only by transforming and evolving into an active player and member of the global regulatory enterprise are they going to be able to really prioritize their local high-risk public health challenges, put the resources they have available on those, and figure out how to leverage and use the resources that are available to them in the global regulatory community to help them make other decisions that they also have to make. That medical products now are no longer national products, that from their inception to when patients have access to them, they are truly global commodities, and that at any given point in time, they might or might not be under the effective oversight of a competent authority, and that people around the world, not only in high-income countries, but middle-income countries and low-income countries, people around the world continue daily to bet their lives that what they are getting when they get access to a medicine is indeed what they think it is. And I think we all know, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, and clearly on many parts of the internet, that that is not what one gets when one has access to certain products. There are multiple factors that will continue to force this further evolution of the systems by which we regulate medical products. And I think also the expectations we as patients and consumers have of those systems. Clearly, globalization, as we've talked about, will continue to drive many of the changes. The greater interagency dependency and reliance on each other will become a 21st century best practice. The new technologies in manufacturing, in clinical trials methodologies, in statistical methodologies will drive changes in how we've done regulation, and particularly products that no longer fit the 20th century stovepipes of drugs, medicines, diagnostics. The rise of health technology assessment in many countries around the world, and this issue of who is deciding about purchasing drugs versus who is deciding about the safety, quality, efficacy of drugs will continue to be a driving theme in the 21st century as those two agencies and efforts decide how they can best not be redundant, but be efficient in answering the questions that the people are asking both of them to answer. And then finally, the greater consumer empowerment and knowledge that comes with the knowledge explosion and the access to knowledge that people have now that is clearly part of the 21st century in most parts of the world will continue to drive the debate on the status of products and access to products and how people receive the messages about products and make their decisions as to whether they want access and can get access to the products they need.